Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. I know what you need, some more rock and read. Today we'll read chapter 4 of Runnin With The Devil, written by Van Halen's manager, Noel Monk. I was going to wait a few weeks to read from this book again, but someone asked me if I could read the next chapter sooner, so I said, sure. Chapter 4 is called M&Ms and Guacamole. Let's see what happens. A young band has to learn to stand up for itself in any number of ways, pushing back against abusive or bullying tactics from a variety of sources, both expected and unexpected. It is assumed, after all, that a new band will find innumerable hands in its pockets, from crooked promoters and managers to record company executives of questionable moral fiber. But the road is a more savage existence, and the challenges can come from those with whom you are supposed to be building a collegial relationship, like the other bands with whom you share the stage every night. Nowhere is it written that a headlining act has to be particularly magnanimous toward the band on its undercard. In fact, the relationship often plays out in exactly the opposite way. An undercard band can expect to be at best tolerated, at worst disrespected and given short strife at every opportunity. Like so many other aspects of the music business, it's a test. Opening night at the Aragon Ballroom, when Van Halen was given so little space to perform, was a perfect example of how we were viewed by Journey and Montrose. We were the new guys on the team, and we would have to prove ourselves worthy of better treatment. Sometimes this can be accomplished simply by outperforming the other bands, regardless of the length of the set. But occasionally things must be handled in a more confrontational manner. To put it bluntly, sometimes you have to get your hands dirty. For example, getting an appropriate sound check proved to be an ongoing exercise in frustration during the early part of the first tour. A triple bill can be great for fans and promoters, but it can be challenging for the bands themselves, especially for the band on the lowest rung of the ladder. As the headliner, Journey got to set up its equipment first and take the first sound check. Ronnie Montrose, billed second, got the next sound check. After a week of standing around in the wings waiting and watching while Ronnie did his guitar wizard act, like he had anything on Edward, the frustration began to mount. Ronnie would stand there for an hour or more, painstakingly tuning his guitar, long after his bandmates had left the stage. I can appreciate a quest for perfection as much as the next guy, but this was inconsiderate and frankly unprofessional. Are these guys ever gonna get off the stage? David said one day, and I knew then that we had to address the issue head on. Wait over there, I told him, pointing to the side of the stage. Make sure they can see you. Why? Edward asked, clearly unsure of where I was going with this. Don't worry about it. Just follow my lead. I had already discussed the possibility of an altercation between Montrose and his guys with our small but dedicated and feisty crew, who were more than willing to help out. I had expected that they'd be upset by the news, but far from it. They were excited. There was blood in the air, and they were ready to help me establish the respect that was deserved and had been sorely lacking up to this point. We were fed up and poised to draw a line in the sand. I'd outfitted them with the same type of gear that we'd worn on the Sex Pistols tour. All black outfits, kicked the out-of-use steel-toed boots, and thick, heavy police belts with handcuffs and flashlights clangling and dangling ominously from the loops. They had a strong, intimidating effect, and just strapping this stuff on gave the crew a sense of empowerment. The guys in the band were a bit wary of the outfits, but went along for the ride. They knew nothing would happen to them. Trust me, I said. A show of strength is usually all that's necessary. Hope so, David said, smiling nervously. As Ronnie continued with his endless guitar tweaking, I got my guys together and we moved into position. On my cue, a slight, well-timed head nod, my road crew and I began walking toward him. We formed a rough semicircle around him, closing in until we were almost on top of him, and Ronnie finally looked up. Is there a problem? He asked nonchalantly, almost like he had no idea why we might be interested in an impromptu summit. Yeah, Ronnie, actually, there is, I said. We need to do our sound check. Time is getting tight here. Ronnie barely made eye contact with me or the band, instead looking away and continuing to noodle with chords in the same mind-numbingly irritating fashion. My roadies tightened their little protective circle as he played, and after a few moments of this incessant bull, he finally answered us. Yeah, sure. He sounded bored, like we were the ones wasting his precious time. I'll be done in a little while. When? I asked. What I did not say was, if you think you're getting out of this one, you got another thing coming, pal. Ronnie looked up at me, then at my guys, then his own guys, who were in the wings and in no position to defend him. He shrugged. It'll only be a few minutes. It was more than a few minutes, but not much more. We did the exact same thing at the next show and the show after that, and eventually the message was delivered and received. Van Halen began to get a block of time sufficient to adjust its gear and do a proper sound check. The boys obviously were happy about this. They were also fascinated. Although Alex and Edward were not adverse to throwing drunken haymakers at one another every so often, the band was not by nature composed of fighters. They were party boys, and since they were brand new to the whole concept of touring, they had never seen or even envisioned this type of conflict before. They assumed the bands out on the road together enjoyed a sort of a spirit de corps. This was sometimes true. More often, they were rivals. The fact that Van Halen was signed as a third act, yet quickly demonstrated an ability to blow the headliners away, probably didn't help matters any. The band quickly embraced the notion that a three-act tour was something of an athletic event, a test of endurance, strength, and balls, as well as of musical ability. We were on the road 7 days a week, sometimes playing 5 or 6 shows, a brutal schedule for just a single truck and a bunch of young road warriors. There was no consideration given to the possibility of fatigue or boredom. We played and traveled and drank and smoked and screwed. We didn't worry about the consequences, especially the guys in the band. They were too young and energetic to care. The ability to live this life day after relentless day, to get by on little or no sleep, and still put on one hell of a show the next night was a badge of honor. If you were Van Halen, you wanted to give your fans a thrill every night. You always wanted to blow Montrose and Journey right off the stage, and you didn't accomplish any of these things by behaving in a quiet or subservient manner. You stood up for yourself before and after the show, and once you were on stage, you kicked ass with no concern whatsoever about offending the delicate egos of a band whose name stood atop the marquee. Ronnie Montrose, Journey. Van Halen was on a mission. David was the first to get on board with this attitude. It wasn't a huge jump from who he was at his core anyway, although I later realized that David was a talker, not a fighter. Around this same time, for example, he initiated a workplace dress code. Anyone associated with the band, artist or crew, was required to wear either a shirt emblazoned with some form of the Van Halen logo or a plain black shirt. Under no circumstances was anyone permitted to wear an article of clothing that bore the logo or name of another band. This might sound obvious, but you'd be surprised how often such an etiquette was ignored. It wasn't uncommon in those days for roadies, many of whom had worked for multiple bands over the years, to pull an old t-shirt out of the drawer and throw it on, so you might end up with a roadie working a Grateful Dead tour and wearing a Jefferson Airplane tee. Most bands frankly didn't give a so long as the job was done well. David, and us versus them kind of guy, saw it differently. We were already a close-knit unit, but David believed that there was something to be gained by proclaiming that allegiance to the world, all day, every day. That said, I can't deny that the wardrobe etiquette had precisely the desired effect. It galvanized the band and the crew. Only once did I hear anyone complain, and that was when Journey offered shirts to everyone on the Van Halen crew. They were specifically designed for us with Van Halen printed on the front, but they also bore the Journey logo. They were extremely cool shirts, and it was a genuinely thoughtful gesture on the part of Journey to do this. Nevertheless, they were never worn. Not in public, anyway. Eventually, we had our own special shirts made for the crew to denote their different but vital role within the organization. That first tour, however, was a nameless, grueling affair. We settled for Van Halen shirts and plain brown leather jackets. Nevertheless, we were building both a name and a brand, not to mention a reputation. Within a month, Van Halen had become a much bigger attraction than Montrose, and by the third or fourth month, we were promoting a debut album that had gone gold. Between the albums and the sold-out shows, we had arguably become bigger than Journey. We were definitely a hell of a lot more fun. Journey was a slick and polished band riding the luminescent vocals of Steve Perry. They were radio-friendly, candy to the ears. Van Halen, meanwhile, was raw and unpredictable. You never knew from night to night exactly what David was going to say or which direction Eddie might go with one of his breathtaking solos. No two shows were exactly the same, which, if you're a fan of true rock and roll, is a very good thing indeed. Everyone associated with the tour benefited from Van Halen's sudden and soaring popularity. Not just Warner Brothers, which also had Montrose under contract, but Journey's label Columbia as well. We played one sellout after another in front of raucous, screaming crowds. A few months earlier, this was a modest double-header featuring one band, Journey, finally achieving success after many years of trying, and another, Ronnie Montrose, on the downslope. Now, it was a triple bill that included as its opening act, almost ludicrously, one of the hottest and most entertaining acts in the business. If you were a fan of guitar rock, this was one hell of a bargain, because Van Halen would never again be playing a supporting role in venues this small at such a low price point. You want to know who wasn't happy? Ronnie Montrose and Journey. Sure, we were helping them fill arenas and make money. We were also setting a nightly standard that they could not match. Typically, a warm-up band merely tries to survive the tour without it getting booed off the stage. Disinterest is about the best you can hope for. Not on this tour. After a few months, Van Halen was a warm-up act in its name only. We were selling as many, if not more, records as Journey and attracting just as many fans. And we sure as put on a better show. Don't get me wrong, Steve was a fantastic vocalist with an impressive range and style. Technically speaking, he was 10 times the singer David Lee Roth would ever be. But he was only half as charismatic as David, whose howling, growling delivery and impromptu monologues, combined with a tendency to prowl the stage like a feral cat, lent every performance an air of mystery and danger. He was an actor playing a part, and he played it perfectly. Steve was a nice enough guy, and normally we all got along just fine off stage, but with Van Halen's sudden surge in popularity, the guys in Journey naturally became defensive and territorial. It didn't help that by the time Journey was set to hit the stage, the boys from Van Halen were already in full party mode, which sometimes interfered with Steve's preparation. Here's the way it worked. While Van Halen churned through its 35 to 40 minute set, which was never lengthened despite the band's rapid ascent, I'd snag as many promotional people as I could find and escort them to our dressing room. As we were a new band on its first tour, we had a feeble little contract writer at the time. A writer is basically a list of items required by a particular artist at a given venue. Writers can be short and sweet, or they can be long and gratuitous, depending on the status and ego of the artist involved. A writer can and often does include food and beverage requirements, backstage access for family and friends, dressing room specifications, and other things. The degree to which one is considered a diva, i.e. an whole, can often be measured simply by the number of items in the rider and by their absurdity, which is not to say that a rider is unimportant. It's actually very important, which is why Van Halen wound up a couple years later with a rider that included, rather famously, a demand that the dressing room be well stocked with M&M candies, but with all the brown M&Ms removed. Yes, it is true, and I was the architect of this little feat of genius, at the band's urging, but I assure you that there was a method to my madness, so to speak. You see, the intent of this portion of the rider wasn't to create more silly and degrading work for some poor promoter's assistant or unpaid intern, although that was an unintended byproduct, but instead acted as a sort of insurance clause that proved that the things that really did matter in our contract, safety measures and the like, had been given proper weight and consideration. We figured that if a promoter took the time to remove all the brown M&Ms from the bowl before putting them in our dressing room, it was far less likely he'd screw up any of the other really important stuff. It gave the promoters a headache and made us look like a bunch of heads, sure, but it saved me time and it prevented something going wrong for the band. When Van Halen was signed to its first tour, however, the band was in no position to demand much of anything, so the dressing room was rather austere. I'd usually augment the rider by asking the promoter for some beer and soda. Then on my own I'd buy some Jack Daniels, mostly for Michael, some vodka, maybe a little scotch, and we'd set up a little bar backstage. David usually had some weed on him, maybe coke if it was a special occasion, like a Tuesday, and as soon as the show ended we'd throw ourselves a little party. The promotional guys loved visiting our dressing room. It was a fun and lively place, especially after a few months on the road, when the band experienced a massive uptick in the quantity and quality of the young women who craved backstage access. Edward, David, and Al were getting laid all the time, every night, sometimes multiple times per night. Michael, not so much, but not for lack of opportunity. He simply rebuffed most advances. It was rather perplexing to the other guys in the band, but it was just one of the many reasons I liked and admired Michael. He had his priorities straight, and he knew where his loyalties lay, with his high school sweetheart Sue Hendry, unlike the other boys whose priorities were to lay as many different women as humanly possible, which is quite a lot if it's a Tuesday and the extracurricular activities are being fueled by copious amounts of blow. Alex accumulated the most partners. Both his appetite and stamina seemed boundless, and he made no effort to harness any of his compulsions. Many nights the party was in full bloom before Montrose even began playing, which left Journey in the unfortunate position of trying to warm up and prepare in the middle of a Van Halen bacchanal. One night, a member of the Warner Brothers promotional staff passed out in the dressing room shower. I'm not sure how or when he got home. Hell, he might still be there. Another time I walked into the dressing room while Montrose was still on stage. The room was eerily quiet, an immediate indication that something was seriously amiss. The whole band was there along with some of the guys from Journey and other various hangers-on. Ordinarily the place would have been rockin'. This time, in stark contrast, it felt almost funeral. I thought briefly about backing out of the room and claiming plausible deniability before I finally asked, "What's going on here, guys?" I was met with complete silence, and my heart sank. I looked around the room. My gaze came to rest on a large and well-lit, full-length mirror, the type artists would normally use to check themselves out before going on stage. For some reason, there was a broad green streak running diagonally down the length of it, as if someone had splashed paint on it. In the middle of this swath was a large man-shaped gap, as if someone had been standing in front of said mirror when the went down. I moved in to get a better look. Around me, no one said a word. I reached out to touch the evidence, and on closer examination, the paint revealed its true nature. It was guacamole, thick and vicious, and already starting to turn brown. Oh... I turned to face the band. David and Edward were slumped in their chairs, trying not to make eye contact with me. I didn't blame them. "All right, boys," I said, mustering up all my courage and preparing for the very real possibility of our being kicked off the tour. "Out with it. What the happened?" If that makes me sound like a parent dealing with children, well, that's pretty much the way I felt. After a few moments of tense silence, Edward spoke up. "David started it," he said, pointing an accusatory finger. "He threw a bowl of peanuts at me." There was a pause, and I noticed David trying to stifle a laugh. "Are you kidding me?" I thought. "You, Dave," Edward said and looked back at me. "See, I had to retaliate. He deserved it." This was excellent logic for a 6-year-old, and I suppose for a rock star. "What did you do, Edward?" I asked. By now they were all laughing. The tension began to clear from the room, no doubt being absorbed straight into my shoulders and chest instead. "I threw a bowl of guacamole at David's head," Edward explains, shrugging and smiling that goofy grin of his. "But I hit Steve instead." Oh boy. Steve? As in Steve Perry? I braced myself for an answer I knew I wouldn't like, and Edward nodded sheepishly. Someone giggled. Well, I thought, that's the end of that. We've had a good run. Time to pull the soil over the freshly dug graves that Edward Van Halen had dug for us and call it a night, I said, rubbing at my mustache and trying not to lose my cool. Something funny happens to you in the middle of a disaster. Sometimes you're able to hold it together just long enough to try to fix the show. "Where is he?" I asked. David nodded toward the bathroom. "In there, I think." The next thing I knew, I had gone against every single instinct I had and walked into the bathroom, where I found Steve standing in front of the sink. From the top of his luxurious mane of silky black hair to the middle of his shimmering new sateen journey jacket, he was completely covered in guacamole. "Hey, Steve," I tried to keep my tone gentle and the sheer terror out of my voice. "You okay?" Steve slowly turned around so that I could get a full frontal view of the onslaught. "I was going to wear this on stage tonight," he told me, tapping the chest of his jacket, his lower lip quivering. "Look at it now. It's ruined." Words failed him, and for a moment I thought he was about to erupt, to start screaming, to demand that we pay for damages and leave the tour immediately, have our heads mounted on spikes and set outside the front doors of our next gig. But instead, he simply began crying, a soft, sad little whimper, and I felt bad for him. Aw, poor Steve. Here he was, an emerging rock star fronting a ridiculously popular tour, and he had been reduced to tears by a pack of food-fighting kids. I can only imagine that Steve must have felt like he was back in middle school, crammed into a cafeteria with a bunch of heartless, mean children. If it had been me, I would have thrown that bowl of guacamole right back at Edward, or punched him in the face. Maybe both. Alas, for better or for worse, not everyone is built this way. Steve had a titanic voice, but it came from a small and gentle man. He was an artist, not a fighter or a guacamole thrower. "It's okay, Steve," I said. I won't lie, I was a little relieved, but I did my best to conceal that fact. "We'll get you cleaned up and we'll find you another jacket." "There's not enough time." "Sure there is." I offered him a smile and armed myself with paper towels. For the next half hour I stood in that bathroom and helped wipe guacamole from Steve Perry's hair, face, and clothes, all the while talking to him, trying to cheer him up and keep our asses from getting canned. Eventually, through much hard work and determination, we reached a point of respectability, if not outright cleanliness. He still smelled faintly of avocado and onion, sure, but you had to be awfully close to notice. It certainly could have been worse. "How do I look?" he asked. "You look great, Steve. Go get him." As we walked out of the bathroom, Edward was the first to speak. "You okay, Steve?" He sounded apologetic. Steve, ever the trooper, nodded at him. "I'm fine. Don't sweat it." They didn't. No sooner had Steve exited the dressing room than the party resumed, albeit with a noticeable absence of guacamole. I breathed a sigh of relief. Later that night, I was approached by Journey's capable but understandably exasperated road manager, Pat Bubba Morrow. Bubba was in the unfortunate position of having to act as an intermediary between the bands. As tour manager of the headliner, he also took most of the heat when our boys acted out, which they did quite frequently. "Noel, this can't continue," he said. "You guys have got to start behaving better, or we're going to ask you to leave the tour." I understood his dilemma. I also knew that since Van Halen deserved as much credit as Journey for the tour's success, he was in no position to make threats. We were selling far too many tickets to be tossed off the tour, notwithstanding trashed hotel rooms, ketchup massacres, or any collateral damage from the occasional guacamole bomb. Did we get credit for not setting anything aflame? No, we did not. I presume Bubba's complaints eventually made their way to Warner Brothers, because I next received a call from Jane, the booking agent for the tour. "They're going to throw you off the tour if you keep this up." Her tour was serious, a bit like that of an elementary school principal. I felt bad that she had been put in this position. Frankly, I had very little control over the band's actions. As long as they were getting from town to town and playing well, what was I going to say? And under the circumstances, Warner Brothers had no more control over the situation than I did. They wanted to make money, and Van Halen was making them a lot of it, both in record sales and at the gate. After all, the band was being paid at a relative pittance for their efforts, $750 per show, split 4 ways. Oh, and $25 per diem to cover meals and other sundries. Think about that. Each night when Van Halen went on stage, each band member earned approximately $187 to perform. Given the fact that we were selling between 2,500 and 8,000 tickets per night, and promoting a record that had already achieved gold status and would reach platinum before the end of the tour, it's fair to say that Van Halen was a good investment for Warner Brothers. And that's not even factoring in the band's onerous initial contract. It would have been self-destructive, if not downright crazy, for the label to pull Van Halen from the tour. Hell, we were the tour. Come on, Jane, I said. Let's be honest. How are they going to throw us off the tour? You'd have half-empty arenas without us. There was a long pause, followed by a deep sigh of resignation. It was a hollow threat, and Jane knew it. Well, you have a point there, she said, but can't you please do something about their behavior? Like what? I don't know. Something. Anything. Okay, I'll talk to them, I said. And I did. Not that it mattered. They were having too much fun to sweat the details or worry about the mess. That was my problem. In the 1970s, if you wanted to listen to music in the privacy of your own home, choosing your favorite artist and repeating a track as many times as you wanted, there were only a few options, and vinyl was by far the best. People bought LPs by the boatload in those days, great silky slabs of black vinyl. If you wanted to hear just a single song, you might buy the single, a small but shimmering vinyl disc. Put the record on your turntable and bask in the sonic purity. You could hear everything on vinyl, every note of every instrument, from the loudest and strongest guitar riff to the subtlest background vocals. And if you wanted to hear a particular track over again, you had to do it manually, gently picking up the tone arm, moving it back a few grooves, and dropping it carefully in place. To anyone born in the last 25 years, all this must seem terribly quaint, not to mention ponderous and unwieldy, as well as a colossal waste of time. Digital content and streaming services have made old-school equipment and vinyl records as obsolete as wired telephones and tube TVs. To all but the nightclub DJ and the serious audiophile, the vinyl record is nothing more than a relic of a bygone era. But what an era! If you loved music in the pre-digital days, chances are you owned records, lots of them. They filled your bookshelves or empty milk crates. They provided a fortress, literal and metaphorical, from the outside world. Unless you were stupid enough to buy a risk-free membership in the Columbia Record and Tape Club, the only one way to expand your vinyl horizons was by visiting a record store. There was nothing quite like wandering up and down the aisles, looking at the posters on the walls, thumbing through the latest releases. You could kill a couple hours just wandering around Sam Goody's or Tower Records, listening to music, soaking up the sights and smells, reading jacket notes. Record stores brought together a diverse community bound by a single trait, a love of music. Didn't matter if you favored country, jazz, or R&B, rock, metal, or disco. Whatever your taste, they could be satisfied under a single roof. Retail outlets were the logical endgame for the record labels. A band was introduced to an audience on radio, made real through live performances, and then promoted on vinyl. The record store was, in a very real sense, the heart of the industry, and as such, it demanded a certain quid pro quo from the artists whose careers it supported and promoted. Thus was born the in-store appearance, wherein fans got an opportunity, however brief, to meet the artist. These were not unlike bookstore appearances by authors, except decidedly less articulate and usually much more profane, but probably a lot more fun. Van Halen did a few of those during that first tour, always in conjunction with a concert and sometimes in addition to a radio interview. The boys were utter novices at the marketing game in those days, and not yet so full of themselves that they bristled at the idea of promotional responsibilities. In fact, they kind of enjoyed those appearances. Early in the tour, we attracted only about 30 to 40 fans, very low-key affairs. Our record was playing in the background, but so low you could hardly hear it. As the guys scrawled their names on souvenir records and posed for pictures with what I can now only regard as fans who were well ahead of the learning curve, I decided to turn up the music, and I mean way up, until the wall reverberated with the wails of Edward's guitar. Fans began dancing in the aisles. "Hey!" the manager shouted. "What are you doing? It's an old sound system. You're gonna blow it up." "Ah, who the cares?" I said. "We're a rock and roll band, and this is a rock and roll event." The manager turned down the music and stormed away. I waited a minute and turned it back up again. For the next half hour, we staged a battle for control of the in-store sound system. Just as we were getting ready to leave, I cranked it up as high as it would go, and sure enough, the speakers blew. The manager was furious, but I scored major points with the boys, who thought the confrontation hilarious. "Way to go!" they shouted. "It up!" A few weeks later, we did another appearance, this time with roughly 75 to 100 people. Once again, the music was very low, and again, I cranked up the volume. This time, the store manager simply smiled and nodded. Definitely a guy better suited to the business. A few more weeks passed while we were kicking ass during live shows and accumulating record sales. In those days, there was a vital statistic in the music business known as a 10-day, aptly named because it tracked how many units of a particular album had been sold in the previous 10-day period. With this, you could measure not just total sales, but whether a record was trending up or down. Van Halen was trending up, better with each 10-day report. It was exactly the type of performance that made record company executives swoon, indicating that a band is capable of not just a momentary surge of popularity, but something more profound, enduring popularity. A similar trend could be seen in our record store appearances, so when I got word from a Warner Brothers publicity associate that our next appearance was expected to draw a crowd of a couple hundred fans, I decided that it was time to put forward a bit of extra effort. "Guys, you can't go in there like four schleps in a station wagon," I said. "We have to do something different." "How about motorcycles?" David suggested. "That would be cool." He was right. It would be cool. I got in touch with the local motorcycle club and offered them $500 to let us use a few of their bikes and to have them escort us to the store. They agreed, and we rolled up on a couple dozen Harley-Davidsons. As we approached the store, everyone revved their engines. If you've never heard a Harley with its distinctive you know how loud that was. Let's just say we made one hell of an entrance. As expected, a couple hundred fans were waiting in line, and more kept showing up. The band happily signed records and posed for pictures for a couple hours until I finally pulled the plug, leaving about 30 unhappy customers to go home sad and empty-handed. I felt bad about it, but we had reached the point where in-store appearances were becoming unwieldy. It was impossible to satisfy everyone. Better to leave them hungry. This was my philosophy. That's why I always preferred playing a smaller, sold-out venue to a larger venue with a sea of empty seats, even if the latter would sell a few more tickets. There was one more in-store appearance on that first leg of the tour, and we knew the crowd would be huge. "What did we do for an encore?" I asked the boys. "Well, we can't do motorcycles again," David said with a laugh. Then a mischievous look came over him. "I got it. Let's get an armored car." So that's what we did. We arrived at the store in an armored car like a Brinks truck and parked by the curb. For a few minutes we just sat inside as the crowd of fans at the door tried to figure out what was going on. Suddenly the back door of the truck was thrown open. Security guards, actually members of our crew, jumped out of the truck and brandished Fox weapons as the rest of us poured out the back. The crowd burst into applause as the boys walked into the store smiling and waving, looking exactly like the young rock stars that they were. And so it went, one town after another, one show after another, week after endless week, month after exhausting month, and it wasn't as if we were traveling in elegance. The first few weeks our gigs were relatively close together, but we traveled by bus, which the boys enjoyed. It was basically a non-stop traveling party. It also was an anomaly. "Don't get used to this," I said, "because you won't be doing it again until you become superstars." Eventually we would travel the country like most platinum-selling bands, on a private bus tricked out to look and feel like a hotel on wheels. For now, though, we settled for cheap air travel, coach seats on little commercial jets. If you travel only once in a while, this isn't such a big deal, but when you're boarding a plane every other day, it starts to beat you down, both physically and emotionally. The cramped seats, the lousy service, the long waits in line, we were just like all the other human sardines trying to get to the next stop without falling from the sky in a fireball. Some people find that frequent air travel eases their anxiety about the potential for catastrophe. Turbulence is nothing more than a bump in the road. Lightning almost never causes an engine to blow out, while for others, each flight renews their sense of impending doom. The response is easy to understand, if not entirely logical. The more you fly, the greater the odds that you'll eventually crash and burn. While none of the band or crew particularly cared for commercial air travel, most of them adapted to it just fine. It was easy for me, as I already spent a considerable chunk of my life traveling and living abroad. The only person in our entourage who truly detested flying was David, a fact that he did his best to conceal, but which eventually became obvious and presented a rather significant challenge. The first sign was a growing reluctance on David's part to get his ass out of bed in the morning and pack his bags for a timely departure. As I said, no one was particularly fond of this routine, including yours truly, but it was a fundamental part of the job. Sleep deprivation and hangovers were the rule rather than the exception when we were out on the road, but you learned to fight through it and get to the next city. When you're young and reasonably healthy, you can get away with almost endless abuse, and God knows Van Halen pushed that theory to its limits and beyond. Everyone about my morning wake-up call. It didn't matter if the phone rang at 6:30 or 9:30, the response was always the same, a string of obscenities followed by the sound of the receiver being slammed down into its cradle. My ego would be a little worse for wear, sure, but 30 minutes later, bags were indeed packed, and inside an hour, everybody would be in the lobby, sipping coffee, wearing shades, and grousing about how tired they were. Except David. Almost every day I would have to make a personal visit to David and coax him down to the lobby. I'd walk into his room and his gear would be scattered about the floor. He'd be sitting in a chair, half-dressed, watching TV, pulling on a joint, acting like he was in the middle of a week-long stay. "David, what the are you doing?" I'd say. "Let's move." He'd sort of roll his head, stretch a little, let out a groan, or two, generally behaving like an arthritic old man. In fact, David was easily the fittest and most athletic member of the band, but on getaway day, he always behaved like a boxer who had gone 12 rounds the night before. "Man, I don't feel good," he'd say. "What's the problem exactly?" I tried to indulge him for a few minutes, but no longer. I figured he was just being lazy. "Not sure, man. Everything just hurts. Maybe I'm coming down with something." "Okay, well, try coming down with your bags, because we're out of here in 10 minutes, with or without you." Oftentimes I'd end up scooping up his clothes and stuffing them into suitcases, while David trudged around the hotel room looking for his keys or his wallets, or his condoms, or whatever. Something was always missing. It was enormously strange and frustrating behavior coming from someone who was generally the most organized and fastidious member of the band. Eventually we made our way to the lobby, where Alex, Edward, and Michael would be waiting impatiently. Sometimes they'd yell at David, sometimes they'd take it out on me. It wasn't a huge deal at this juncture because they all got along so well and were having such a great time, but it was clear that they found David's acts selfish and irresponsible. Hell, we all could have used a few more minutes of sleep, but only David seemed to demand it on a daily basis. They thought it was a power play of some sort. David, after all, was the diva, but it turned out to be asymptomatic of something much deeper, a near crippling fear of flying. Not sure why it took me as long as it did to put the pieces of the puzzle together. The stomach aches, the refusal to adhere to a schedule, and especially the incessant chatter once we boarded the plane. Some nervous flyers shut down completely once they're sealed in that metal death trap of a tube. They might practice meditation or listen to music, or pop a Valium and hope it takes effect long before the plane is airborne. Others reveal their anxiety through hyperactivity. Now, David was a talker under the most mundane of circumstances, so even this quirk escaped me at first. David enjoyed sitting next to me on flights so that we could talk about the business of the business, rather than just reliving the sexual and chemical exploits of the previous night. He wanted to know what sort of publicity requirements there would be at our next stop, what the venues would be like, how big a crowd was anticipated. Invariably, we'd veer off into more arcane territory, sales figures and promotional strategy, and even what the next album might sound like. Truthfully, much of this was out of my purview, as I was merely the tour manager and not the band's personal manager, but since Marshall was only occasionally on the road with us, he would jet out for a night and then go right back to LA. The question came to me. But there was something else at work, a desperate attempt on David's part to distract himself from the admittedly terrifying reality of flight. He would usually take the aisle seat to avoid being accidentally confronted with a 30,000-foot view down, or he'd take the window seat and draw the shade. Any unexpected movement or sound, from the rumble of turbulence to the simple and not unexpected raising and lowering of the wheels, caused David to squirm in his seat and his speech to accelerate like he was on speed. Eventually, after several weeks of this behavior, I noticed him clutching the armrest so hard during takeoff, I thought that he might leave his fingernails behind. His eyes were closed, his jaw clenched. And then it hit me. Holy, David is absolutely terrified. As I got to know David better, it all made sense. David was a total control freak, and flying is all about accepting the fact that there are forces in the universe way beyond your control. Sometimes the flight is smooth and easy and you arrive ahead of schedule. Sometimes there are technological or weather-related issues that make the flight as queasy as a poorly designed amusement ride. Once in a great while, human error comes into play, and you drop from the sky like a stone, never to be heard from again. and there's not a thing you can do about it. Sort of like the music business. Well, that's the end of Chapter 4. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 4 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.